Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our YANGTime webinar this afternoon. Today we have Todd Campo from IHS. Todd is Aftermarket Product Manager for North America at IHS Automotive. He has over 13 years of experience in the aftermarket industry. In his role at IHS, he is responsible for the management of the data and software products that are sold into the North American aftermarket, including recently launched Worldview 2.0. Prior to IHS, Todd spent 3 years as a catalog manager at Gates Corporation and over 7 years in data management at Mala Klebite. Todd served for 6 years on the Auto Care Technology Standards Committee, serving as ACE's subcommittee chairman and on the Standards Oversight Committee for many of those years. He has been involved for several years in shaping both the aftermarket catalog enhanced standards, known as ACEs, and the Product Information Exchange Standards, known as PIEs. Todd received his AAP designation in 2012, his ACP designation in 2013, and his MAAP in April of 2014. Todd was recognized with the Auto Care Association Impact Award in 2013 at Apex. Todd holds a Master's of Science degree in Sports Management and a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science, both from Eastern Michigan University. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Todd. And as always, we'll take questions at the end of the webinar. You can type those into the chat box on the right side of your screen. Enjoy the webinar.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Katie, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on emerging global vehicle markets. IHS Automotive would like to thank the Auto Care Association and the Yang Advisory Council for the opportunity to present some insights on global vehicle markets to you today. Many of the statistics that we will discuss today can be found in the Auto Care Fact Book, available through the association. And just to reiterate what Katie said, for the webinar, we will work through the whole presentation and hold addressing questions to the end. But please don't let that prevent you from submitting questions throughout the presentation through the GoToWebinar interface. As we get into the slide deck, you'll see that there's a slide number in the lower right-hand corner of each slide. So feel free to use that when you submit a question so that we can quickly return back to a slide if we need to during the question and answer session. Now let's get started. During today's webinar, we will attempt to address the question of what characteristics can be used to indicate markets that may be good bets for aftermarket growth. Just because a market has a large vehicle population only tells part of the story. And realistically, everyone has visibility on the large markets. China, Western Europe, and North America aren't sneaking up on anyone. But there are other markets around the globe that are also showing potential to support healthy aftermarkets. And those who use available insights to dig a little deeper into these potential markets may be able to position their companies to proactively react to opportunities as they emerge rather than after the fact. So in today's presentation, we'll focus on 4 key market characteristics that can be used to evaluate a market's potential. And then we will, toward the end of the presentation, we'll dive into some specific markets. We'll look at global economic trends at a very high level, and we'll take the obligatory look at the BRIC markets. So that's all to come during the next probably 35-40 minutes. Briefly before we dive in, here's an overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. First, we're going to cover those 4 key characteristics: vehicle density, vehicle population growth, average age, and miles driven. And then, as I said, we'll take a brief review of the global economic outlook and the BRIC markets. And really, I wanted to add the economic outlook because just looking at the vehicle characteristics of the vehicle population is definitely one key driver. But without the supporting economics, a market potential will stay just that. It'll stay just potential if the economy in the market cannot support further growth, even if there's white space for the vehicle market to grow into. So while it's always good to look at the factors and the characteristics of the vehicle market, you have to temper it based on the economic climate in the region to get a full picture of what the market is going to do. So with no further introduction, we'll jump into the first characteristic, which is vehicle density. Vehicle density can be an indicator of a market's potential for continued growth, as well as provide insight on if a market is nearing the end of a rapid growth cycle. There are many factors under the surface that contribute to vehicle density. Obviously, economic conditions, development of infrastructure, but there does seem to be an upper bound. And we'll look at a couple markets that have a high level of saturation, where you can see that the growth is beginning to slow down. And then we'll look at some markets where there's likely a lot of room for additional growth. Vehicle density could be an interesting metric going forward when you look at it in the light of things like autonomous driving and self-driving vehicles. We may even see those upper bounds even in some of the developed nations begin to come down, which is something we really haven't seen outside a little bit of impact in the Great Recession, but there is the potential that autonomous driving and self-driving vehicles will change vehicle density. It will change the points of inflection, I guess you could say. But luckily for the presentation today, those vehicles are outside the forecast window, which most of the forecasts we'll be looking out to about 2025. And while we expect some of those characteristics of autonomous vehicles to start appearing prior to 2025, we're even seeing some today. We don't expect them to have a huge impact, especially from an aftermarket perspective, till a much later time. So here's a look at global vehicle density, and this chart is measured in vehicles per thousand in the population. And you can see it's across several different markets, and each bar there from top to bottom, 2005 to so the projected for 2024. And as you can see, we expect there to be strong vehicle density growth for Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and even in Central and South America. As you can see, that those markets actually have been growing pretty rapidly from 2005 even to now 2015. And you can look there at the red bar that sticks out a little bit. That's the Mideast. And Asia is kind of the purple bar right below it. And you can see that those numbers are really seeing very rapid growth. And we expect that to really continue all the way through the forecast horizon out to 2025. And then when you compare that to markets like the U.S., or North America and Western Europe and Oceania, those are the three bars that are the longest throughout the whole thing, from 2005 to 2024. But if you look at their growth, for instance, Europe, we expect it to grow from roughly 530 vehicles or so per thousand to just over 600 from 2005 to 2024 over that 20-year period. Oceania is expected to just grow from about 725 to maybe 780, 790 over that 20-year period. And even North America is only expected to grow from about 630 up to about 730. All very respectable growth amounts per thousand people, but when you compare it to the percentage growth that the other markets are going to achieve over the same period, you can definitely see there that some of the emerging markets, excuse me, will likely have great opportunity for the aftermarket in the coming years. So now let's take a deeper look at North America. You may have thought when we first went to these slides that North America would be the most developed market in the world. And if you just took U.S. and Canada, as you can see here, it would have been. But we were comparing North America, U.S., Canada, and Mexico to, for instance, Oceania, which is just Australia and New Zealand in our data. two very developed markets, whereas here in North America we have three markets, two rather developed and one with some development potential in Mexico. And as you can see there, Mexico still has a lot of potential. Right now, in 2015, they're at nearly 300 vehicles, maybe 280 vehicles per 1,000 people in Mexico. And even out through 2025, end of 2024, start of 2025, we only expect that to go to just over 300, 320 or so per 1,000 people. So even out past 2025, Mexico's growth will continue to have very good potential. In contrast, U.S. and Canada, by average, have about 1.2 to 1.4 cars per person right now, and we really don't expect that to move very far. You know, when you think about it at that rate, there's not a lot of space to go. Just a look at a market that we're very familiar with here. And you'll see the trend. I mean, obviously the topic of the presentation was emerging markets, but throughout the presentation, we'll compare a lot of markets to the U.S. because, number one, many of us on the call are very familiar with the United States, and number two, it's you know, in a lot of ways, it's a model aftermarket for the world as far as its size and capacity. So, you know, we'll be looking at trends that show potential markets that are going to move towards being able to support an aftermarket in a positive way. So let's take a look at some markets that are, from a vehicle density growth perspective, are very interesting. So this is our forecast for vehicle density. Again, you can see the green bar for each of the countries is really the current data, 2015, and there's two bars below and two bars above. So we're kind of giving a 20-year look with about 10 years of trend and about 10 years of forecast. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through all these markets, but you can see that there's a lot of growth in this, I think there's 14 markets, where they're going to show some significant increases over the next 10 years, let's say. And then if you remember, if we contrast it back to the United States, where we hang out at about 800 vehicles per 1,000 people, not saying these markets are going to get there. Again, there's a lot of factors that impact this, but if you think about that as kind of the upper bound, there's a look at, you know, places like India and China on this graph. There's a lot of room for those countries to grow. And then, as you can see, many in Western Europe, or Eastern Europe, we're expecting really fast growth from, you know, maybe a couple hundred vehicles per 1,000 for Romania out there. It's kind of the flyer. We expect them to exceed 600 per 1,000 by 2024. So there's lots of growth here. Obviously, there's multiple factors that go into vehicle density growth, because it's a measure of the vehicle population versus the actual population of people living in the market. And, you know, factors like that probably impact China and India, where the population of residents grow very rapidly. For their vehicle population to grow, it has to actually outstrap the population growth. So all those factors go into vehicle density. And so what you'll find throughout the whole presentation is these four characteristics, as well as many others, really almost just build a stool. You need 4 legs to build the stool, in this case, for this presentation. So vehicle density doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's directly related to our next characteristic we're going to touch on, which is vehicle population growth. As population grows, normally density increases, again, as long as the vehicle population growth outpaces the growth of residents. Obviously, for vehicle population, there's certain thresholds where if a market exceeds a certain threshold, it becomes a no-brainer for the aftermarket. You can think of markets like U.S. and China. U.S. has over 250 million vehicles on the road. You have to be a player in the aftermarket in the U.S. If you want to have a global strategy. Same is true for China and Western Europe. They're so large that irrelevant of other, they're going to support an aftermarket. But the key really is to know what other markets and what other regions you should keep an eye on, or you should consider growing your business into, so that you can be ready as they reach the threshold of vehicles registered, vehicle age, vehicle density, and all those factors to support a very vibrant aftermarket. So we're going to take a step back first, and we're going to look at the global light vehicle population. And this chart is a very positive one for really not only new vehicle sales, but also for the aftermarket. In that we're right now we're over about 1.2 billion vehicles this year. That 1.13 is the 2014 number. Excuse me. But we foresee that growing to well over 1.5 billion vehicles by 2025, which is, again, very positive thing for those of us who sit in the aftermarket that is responsible for maintaining many, if not the majority, of those vehicles going forward. But as you can see on the table on the right, between the end of 2014 and the end of 2025, market share will shift significantly across the globe, with North America, Europe, and Japan moving from close to 70% share of the global vehicle market combined down to below 60, probably more like 58, 56% by 2025. Obviously, we know China's a huge growth market. You know, they're going to gain 10% market share, roughly, is what we're projecting by 2025 in the global vehicle population. But if you look at those other numbers, you know, India's seeing growth in share. Latin America is seeing pretty level share. Middle East is seeing level share. And Africa is too. And even seeing level share with the amount of growth that we're seeing is actually an indicator of, you know, pretty positive growth for those markets as the share of total volume shifts from what we call developed markets to emerging markets. So let's take a look at those developed markets for a second. This picture really isn't that bad when you take it by itself. You're seeing good growth in North America. We've seen good growth since 2005, with the exception there. You can see the dips during the Great Recession. Same is true in Europe and Japan. They're not as pronounced in Europe and Japan, but you know, little dips. But all in all, very positive charts when taken by themselves. But when they're taken in the context of the growth in emerging markets, the growth in those developing markets looks pretty mundane and, you know, in a lot of ways, not very interesting. These markets here have growth trends that, you know, that we look at and get very excited about for sure. The rapid trend indicates that, in a lot of cases, these rapid trends indicate that the market sizes will begin to reach the size where they're going to support the aftermarket. And you can look, you know, for different markets, it's going to be a different time. And for your company, for sure, the threshold of when a market is attractive versus another company will be different. But, you know, all of these are showing sustained growth. And the good news is, as there's sustained growth, we'll talk about average age in a few minutes, but the average age, you know, kind of the existing vehicle population continues to grow, or continues to grow in combination, while new vehicle sales continue to move the number up. You know, if you look at China, that blue bar at just over 150 million in 2015, you know, and over the next couple of years, those are going to be entering what would traditionally be considered an aftermarket sweet spot of, you know, 5 years old by around 2020, 2021. So, you know, those vehicles are not being replaced yet, and that's helping to drive the growth. Even in China, where they're selling north of 20 million vehicles per year, which is very impressive, and that's why you see those stair steps. Each year, that existing population is growing, as well. So very good news there. The bad news when you look at China, and we'll talk a little bit more about average age, like I said, in a couple minutes, is those giant stair steps of growth are going to keep average age compressed in China, whereas if you look at India, Latin America, Middle East, the more gradual growth will afford the opportunity for average age to grow a little quicker, likely, than China. And with that, let's talk a little bit about average age. Of all the indicators we talked about so far, a lot of talking about vehicle density and vehicle population, they're very good indicators for the aftermarket, but by themselves, they don't necessarily tell us enough to know if a market is going to be relevant for us or not. They tell us markets that will be relevant eventually, but they don't tell you whether they're going to be relevant now or whether you need, you have 4 or 5 years to develop a strategy. That's where average age really comes in. Because just having a large vehicle population and a high level of saturation is good, but when you can understand the age of the vehicle and be able to compare that to the sweet spot for your product replacement, that's really when you start to have insights that you can action upon for your company. It's not just cool information at that point where, for instance, China's got 150 million vehicles. Well, if you're not seeing replacements till vehicles are 7 years old, then China, you might have a couple years to wait on, and we'll see that in a couple minutes. But average age is what really tells you your opportunity out of that large population, what your potential opportunity is in markets. So again, we're going to take a look at the U.S. to start with, because we know the U.S., for a long time has supported a very vibrant aftermarket, and this has a lot to do with it. We've got a very large vehicle population, and the age of the population has been growing for many years, but it does stay right around that sweet spot. Not a lot of vehicles that are too old, not a lot of vehicles that are too young. We maintain a nice, between 9 and 11 years old for average age over the past 15 years. Just an interesting little factoid here as you look at the chart. If you look 2002 to 2016, average age has grown 2 whole points. But if you look at 2008 to 2011, 2012, in that compressed four-year span or so, it's grown as rapidly as it did the whole rest of the time. So again, we all know what the Great Recession did to our businesses and what it did to our market. But here's another statistic you can see from the Great Recession, where in those years right around those economic hardships, people really were holding on to their cars longer, and we were seeing 3 points of growth in a metric like this on a 250 million vehicle population is pretty significant. And now you'll see the past few years, we've gone back to about a 1/10 of a year per year, and we actually expect that might even slow down more in the coming years for the U.S. But as you can see, that trend is very similar to what it was in 2002 through 2008. Now let's take a look at the globe. And this is a bit of an eye chart for sure, but each one of those sets of columns indicate the country represented below, and the world's right there toward the middle. The country or region, I should say, because some of those are regions. And then you'll see the number that's kind of embedded over the bar. That is the 2013 average age number, and the one at the top of the bar is what we're expecting the average age to be at the end of 2017. As you can see, both the EU and Russia, the European Union and Russia, are expected to age pretty rapidly for a few years, while the rest of our the rest of our BRIC markets really are showing pretty gradual aging, with maybe the exception of China. But China's average age is really compressed pretty low right now at really below 5 years of age. and we really only expect it to get to about 5.5 by 2017. Now the good news there with China, it's not on the chart here, but I believe by 2025 we expect it'll be in the neighborhood of 6.5 years old. So, you know, in the next 4 or 5 years, we're really going to start seeing, I would expect to start seeing a China aftermarket grow pretty substantially, because it'll finally be reaching the size, the market size, where those 20 million new vehicles won't be able to compress the average age the way it has been for the past several years. So 5 got miles driven, and like average age, I find miles driven to be a very fascinating statistic, because again, if you think about vehicle density and vehicle population, those are great, but cars that sit, you know, in the garage and don't get taken out during rush hour and don't get driven to work and are just grocery getters for, you know, 5-10 miles a day, total of 5,000-6,000 miles a year, that's not ideal for us in the aftermarket. We like cars that are getting out there and getting 10,000-15,000 miles a year, and, you know, they're driven in, you know, more stressful situations during rush hour and in traffic and all that stuff. So similar to how average age is a good indicator, we like a bigger number. Miles driven is a good indicator because we like a bigger number here too. And so going back to the stool analogy, this is kind of the fourth leg of the stool. If we've got the vehicle population and we've got the vehicle density and we've got a good looking average age and we can show a good average miles traveled number, then you've probably got a market that if you're not considering getting into, you probably should. Because if they're good age and they're being driven reasonably hard, the parts are going to be breaking, and that's you know, that's great for us. So let's take a look at the global light vehicle miles driven forecast. And these numbers are in billions of miles. So when you look at that 2025 number, we're saying well over 12 trillion miles is what we expect the global light vehicle miles driven to get to. Right now we sit at right around 10 trillion. And we'll look at the U.S. numbers here in a minute to see what the U.S. represents of that. An interesting factoid as we go along, if you look at this chart and you think about that global vehicle growth, vehicle and operation growth, that trend is not too dissimilar than the one we saw a few slides ago for global vehicle and operation growth. So you'd expect miles to increase similarly. So this metric is very nice, and you know, it might give us a warm and fuzzy, but really what we need to get to is at the vehicle level, what is the average number of miles a vehicle is being driven? Because you know, just the total global number doesn't tell us enough when we're trying to figure out what markets we should look at, you know, potentially taking our products into. So here's a little more detail. Broken out by region, you can see the regional share of miles driven. This still doesn't tell us too much, except you know, as you'd expect, Asia Pacific is seeing some pretty significant market share growth over the next 10 years or so. North America looks like it might be growing slightly, but not appreciably. Latin America is going to have some decent growth, as well as the Middle East in share, but overall their total share of the global miles driven is not that big. But Europe, if you look at that kind of light brown bar, it's really interesting that it looks like Europe is staying completely flat over the next 10 years, and really has been basically, statistically speaking, almost completely flat since 2000 in the number of miles driven. So that's an interesting thing there on that chart. And then obviously Africa down towards the bottom, you know, actually seeing a little bit of growth, but again, very small numbers there. Now let's take a look at the U.S. Again, kind of as a control, U.S. Really leads the world in miles driven currently, and probably for the foreseeable future. You can see there we're well over 3 trillion miles driven this year, but you can see the effect there of the Great Recession. 2008, 2009, 2010, the economy was bad, gas prices were high, people just weren't driving their cars as much as they used to, which was not good for us. Good news is today we're on our 4th year of positive trend after those 7 years of flat or declining vehicle miles traveled numbers. And the past 2 years we've had 3 trillion miles or more driven. And as you can see there, last year we set a record. So very positive in that perspective, but when you take a look at a year over year, it's even easier to see the growth year over year, and you can see there 2008 to 2012 really, very small numbers, but even with the positive numbers in 2015, we're not seeing the growth we saw back in the 80s and 90s. But the 3.5% we saw this year is really the best since really probably the mid-90s, early 90s time frame, as you can see. But still that question lingers out there. So we're driving more miles, and that's really good news. But what does that mean on the per excuse me, what does that mean on the per vehicle level? We do expect this trend to continue before I move the slide forward. We think we're going to see that growth at a couple percent, 2 to 3% in the coming years, but raising gas prices or another economic downturn could certainly change that from modest growth to decline again, really on very little notice. So now we get to what I think is the punchline. This is the vehicle miles traveled per capita, and I find this to be pretty intriguing. The dark blue lines in the back are really the same as what we saw on the last slide. And as you can see, the miles traveled total and average miles traveled per capita here in the U.S. has followed a very similar trend really for the past 40 years. Or not the past 40 years, I should say, but the 40 years between 1971 and 2011. But since 2011, they both dipped a little bit, but the miles traveled per person actually dipped faster and deeper than the total vehicle miles traveled. And so far, they actually seem to be staying fairly divergent. I don't know that they're diverging any further, but there's a much wider gap than we've ever seen historically between total vehicle miles traveled and the miles traveled per person average. So this is going to be something to keep your eye on in the U.S. Because it may ultimately result in lower miles traveled per vehicle, which, for the aftermarket is certainly not ideal. So just, I guess just a tidbit there on our market to be thinking about. Unfortunately, the story outside of the U.S. Was even worse during the Great Recession for Europe. Here you can see how hard Europe was really hit. Their peak was nearly 1.95 trillion miles traveled in 2004. But you can see even before the Great Recession hit, that was down well below 1.9 trillion miles. And it's come down significantly further since then even. And really our market experts in Europe don't necessarily expect that this is going to change in the future. They believe in a lot of ways many in the European market have embraced alternative means of travel, alternative means of transportation, so trains and buses and things like that. So they don't expect Europe's miles traveled to get back to where it was in 2004 in the foreseeable future, and maybe not even back to 2008 levels. But again, we're looking here at total market volume. Let's take this down to that average miles per vehicle. And again, you're seeing it broken down here by region. This chart more clearly gives you a visibility of what our expected average miles traveled per vehicle will be, is now there in 2015, 2016, and where we see it going in the future. And you'll see that really there's not a lot of increase in average miles traveled expected out there. Definitely not much in North America, little to none in Europe. But very interestingly, that green line on there, the Asia Pacific line, is very interesting in that we really don't expect miles traveled in Asia Pacific to uptick. They've been coming down since 2000, and really since 2014 they've been around 6,000 and below, and we don't see that growing in the future. So when you think about a market like China, they're going to have a lot of vehicles, but they're going to be driven roughly half as much as they are in the United States. China has an interstate system that is similar to the United States, but many of the vehicles still are in the coastal areas. So while you're seeing 6,000 miles traveled, the question in China will be, because of the congestion in the urban areas, will parts fail more rapidly than we see here in the U.S.? Don't have an answer for that. Obviously, right now we're going to have to see how that plays out. But just on an average miles traveled measure, 6,000 is pretty low for a vehicle per year. So it's very could definitely be a drag on that market. Middle East and Africa, on the other hand, those are the top two lines. Interestingly, kind of lead the pack going forward. So those areas are definitely areas that more research may be warranted depending on your products again, your product mix, and how important miles are to you. But they even outpace the U.S. or it's North America here. We already covered the U.S. is closer to probably 11,000 miles, right in that neighborhood. But the North American total even is only about 8,000 miles a year. So Latin America, Africa, Middle East certainly could be interesting to keep an eye on going forward. And now here's the breakdown by a selected group of countries, and I tried to pick countries across many different regions. I tried to hit on some key countries, and then also just some interesting countries that had growth that made me kind of say, that's interesting. Like Saudi Arabia there. Obviously, the last slide we saw that the Middle East had a high average annual miles driven number. Saudi Arabia is almost off the charts compared to everybody else. And then there you see the United States, right around 12 or 13,000 miles. I think I said 10 or 11 on the last slide, but obviously here, more detailed slides. The U.S. is about 12. Mexico's a light blue line on there. It's hard to see, but there's a blue dashed line that runs from about 9,000 in 2000 up to about 8,000 in 2025. And that's the global average. And you'll see that many countries really toe that line pretty closely going forward. But very interestingly, at the bottom you see India, you see how quickly China's dropped over the past 15 years, and even Russia staying down there pretty low. So obviously average miles traveled is going to be a function of the number of miles traveled by the vehicle population. So China has a hugely growing vehicle population, but it doesn't look like the miles right now are being driven at the rate they used to be driven, even though it's a large population. So something interesting to look at for sure. Keep an eye on going forward. Again, I think I said it at the start. All of these metrics in China, a low average age and a low average miles driven, is not going to take China off the list of markets that we need to have in our strategies going forward. But it just might temper a little bit of the expectation for what the opportunity size actually is going to be. Eventually these are going to, the population will age and the miles, even at 6,000 miles will build. So the opportunity will be there. But the sweet spot in China, for instance, might be further back than it was in the U.S. We'll just have to see the way it develops. Okay, so with all that said, we've looked at the 4 metrics that I wanted to introduce today, and in the course of a 45-minute or so presentation, I've tried to keep it high level. There's so much more about each of these markets that could be dug into, but I want to shift gears and take a look at the economy now, because that's kind of the, if the other 4 indicators are building a stool, without the economic outlook, it's not going to matter anyways. So I wanted to bring a little bit of this in because everything about those 4 market indicators has to be taken in the context of the way the economy is going globally. And what we've been seeing globally this year, past year, 18 months, is we've seen kind of a subpar growth. We haven't fallen necessarily into recession. The U.S. has definitely been on the brink, and depending on who you're talking to, it seems like half people think we're headed to a bear market and half think it's going to be a bull. And in a lot of ways, the Eurozone's been following that same pattern with the British exit and everything, actually being voted on today, I believe. The markets have been, pretty flat for the U.S. and the Eurozone, but it's been worse outside of those 2 zones. So if you take a look here at, again, we're going to keep it pretty macro level, but you can see here our projected GDP growth is about 2.5%, and that's that red dashed line. And you can just look across. We have forecasts out to 2017 for each region, and you can see the world is right along that average. U.S. is right there too, but you can see how far Japan is below. Eurozone, but really the ones that stick out here, slowing growth in China, but it's still very positive. But Brazil and Russia stick out as having come down pretty hard, and we really don't expect them to recover until closer to 2020. And so you might ask, what's caused the BRICS? We've been talking about BRICS for years. What are some reasons why they haven't emerged, so to speak? Why have they taken giant steps back? So you'll see a couple reasons here on the slides. Excess capacity after investment booms, slowing labor force growth, slowing globalization. I'd submit one other thing for consideration. Since we're on the eve of the Rio 2016 Summer Olympics, if you've been watching the news for the past several months, not only is there a Zika concern in Brazil, but there's also a lot of infrastructure concerns and concerns that venues might not be complete in time. And this is in a country that just hosted a World Cup 2 years ago. And then you take Russia, our other one that's been kind of dragging for the past few years. We're only a couple of years removed from the Sochi Winter Olympics, and they're gearing up here for the 2018 Olympics coming in a couple of years. You can call it my economic theory, but it seems that these large international events have caused really huge unsustainable investments in both Brazil and Russia, and they cause very rapid growth initially, but in the end their their economies just can't sustain that. So when, you know, when the building for the Olympics stops, when the building for the World Cup stops, you know, when people come, they get a big boom in their economy, but once it leaves, you know, it's almost like a wave coming in and leaving. Once it goes, it takes quite a while for those markets to recover from that because they can't absorb that rapid of an inflow and then drying up of investments. So in a lot of ways, when we look back at the World Cup and the Olympics in Brazil and Russia, we may find that for those countries and their citizens and their economies, that these huge international events and investments might not end up being positive for them. And we're seeing it obviously in their vehicle market growth too. You might ask, China just hosted Olympics a few years back too. You know, I think they've underutilized their stadiums and other things since the Olympics, but they've seemed to be able to come through it better than Russia and better than Brazil, but their economy is also several times larger than those other two economies. So that's Todd's economic theory. You heard at the start I have a sport management degree, so it's something I've watched for many World Cups and many Olympics. So that's as deep as I can go in economics, though. So I'm going to hop back over to just giving you a summary of the BRIC markets, and then at the end I'll throw up a couple slides about some markets that just look interesting through doing this study. Markets that maybe warrant looking a little deeper. So I've been saying BRIC a lot, and I hope everybody knows what I meant when I said BRIC. But BRIC markets, as you can see there on the slide, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They've kind of been considered the bellwether for emerging markets for probably 5 years or more. And as you know, as we've just talked through, India and China are doing pretty well, but Brazil and Russia have fallen off pretty far. And we'll see this here over the next few slides. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these, but they do show this is our production and sales forecast and actuals over the next several years. And you know, negative numbers in those columns are bad. And you know, as you can see, Brazil's got a lot of negative numbers, and from a vehicle perspective, we don't really expect they're going to see bottom until 2017 or maybe even 2018 before they begin seeing growth in their vehicle market again. And you know, if we went back to that global economic slide, you'd see that that's when we start expecting their GDP to maybe start coming back around 2018. Not a positive outlook. They've got a lot of drags. You can see up there that bad economic environment, poor confidence, you know, and then there's that influx of cash that they just can't support. And to look at it from a vehicle and operation perspective, you can see there was pretty steady growth up there till maybe 2014, but it's really just kind of been muted, and we expect it to be muted out to 2020. And even after 2020, that growth is not very fast. So to summarize the Brazil market here, just kind of put a little summary together. Economic outlook is not good. Growth in vehicles and operations not great. Vehicle densities kind of staying the same. The good news is slow growth in vehicle and operation will help to drive average age up. But you know, people are not driving. The economy is soft. Russia, it's a similar story. Again, I won't spend too much time here, but lots of negative numbers there. Again, we don't necessarily see Russia turning the corner, finding the bottom until, you know, again, probably 17, 18. They've been hurt very much by the reduction in oil and gas prices. You know, their economy was very much reliant on those things. So it looks for a while like Russia will be, you know, pretty negative outlook too. Their vehicle and operation growth is a little better than Brazil, but still not great. So Here's a general summary again. Economic outlook still not good. We don't expect them really to reach global average of GDP until closer to 2024, 2025. Vehicle and operations, again, the growth is positive, but it's certainly slowed due to the economic challenges. Density is increasing, but it's slowing. Again, slowing growth in the vehicle population has a positive impact on average age. But again, the economy is bad, so people are not driving much. And now we come to India. Much more positive. They've already reached bottom. They're recovering. They've benefited from lower interest rates. And they've got a lot of new investment going in infrastructure, which is likely to have positive impact, even on us in the automotive aftermarket. Here's a curve. The numbers are a little smaller than the other ones, but the curve is much more rapid, which is absolutely a positive thing for vehicle and operation growth. So here you see India is much more positive. The economic outlook is good. They're outpacing the world in GDP growth. We expect their VIO to continue to grow at a pretty strong rate. Vehicle density is growing, but we expect it to grow quite a bit more. That's very positive. But average age still, there's enough vehicles on the road that the average age in India is actually also growing. But we just haven't seen the miles driven come along for the ride yet. So that'll be something to watch in India. Because if the miles driven per vehicle starts to grow in India as well, then that'll be a very good news for the aftermarket. And now China, finally, the final of the BRIC nations. Really, the new normal set in. They're still implementing a lot of emission standards. That's a little bit of tier 1, tier 4 cities, things like that. And really good positive news is the reduction in the purchase tax from 10% to 5% for vehicles 1.6 liters and lower. Very positive stimulus there. You see the production sales numbers there, they're all positive, that's good. They weren't certainly as good as 2013, but we'll still take the positive growth. That's a very good factor. And again, we've talked tons today, and you've heard tons about the growth in the Chinese vehicle population, and there you can see it. Again, good growth rate, and even more impressive is that we're talking about vehicle count in the 150 million range growing up to the over 300 million range by 2025. So there's magnitude there. So China, as you can imagine, very positive outlook. They're still outpacing world average GDP. Strong VIO growth, vehicle density is getting better. We expect it to double in the next, by 2025. And the big news is, for the aftermarket, we expect that the average age will begin to increase more rapidly, and we expect it to surpass that 6-year bogey by before 2025. But as well, similar to India, we just haven't seen the increase in average miles driven that we'd like to see. China's interstate system surpassed the U.S.'s, and I believe it was 2013 for the number of miles of interstate highway, but they just haven't taken to driving out into the country like we do here in the U.S. So, but the potential is there, the infrastructure is there, the vehicles are there, and the economic outlook is positive. So China will be a market to watch, especially as that average miles driven goes up. So I would submit to you, after showing you all that in a lot of ways, if you didn't know it already, I'd say the BRICS have kind of become the ICs, with India and China still continuing to grow as expected and as projected. Maybe a little muted over what was thought a few years back, but still very good growth. Brazil and Russia, markets that big will come along, but and they will see the vehicle growth and the economies will recover. but if you're looking at a 5-year horizon, we're not really expecting anywhere near as much out of Brazil or Russia as we are out of India and China. So take that for what it's worth, but let's look at a couple markets outside of the traditional BRICS. So you got Middle East here, and we're winding down to the last few minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through these. For these last couple slides, all I did was growth in vehicle population. So there's something there in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and with Iran opening up, it might warrant, especially when you lay these markets side by side. The geography is not huge. There's certainly some political challenges, but those are going to be pretty good sized markets going out towards 2020. We already saw they drive a lot of miles, so might be something to dig into a little more. And then in Latin America, Argentina and Peru are interesting to us in their growth patterns. You can see Peru is pretty small numbers, but that growth rate is pretty impressive, and Argentina as well, pretty impressive growth rate. So I think AutoCare even has a mission going to Peru shortly. So it might be good to keep an eye on those two markets. And with that, I'll open the floor for questions. Katie, I don't know if we've gotten any.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So we have time for a couple questions. So since miles driven keeps increasing, do you believe the sweet spot will change drastically?
We actually believe that the sweet spot has already changed. And the sweet spot really, when you think about it, is miles driven impacts it, but average age impacts it a lot too. Traditionally, the aftermarket sweet spot in the U.S. has been considered, depending who you talk to, but roughly 6 years to 9 years of age. We would actually submit that due to the number of really old vehicles that are out there now, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 million of the 250 million vehicles on the road in the U.S. are older than 10 years. So, if average age is 11.6 right now, 11.5, whatever, I'd have to say sweet spot probably runs again from 6 years, roughly, when vehicles come off warranty, probably out closer to 12 years than just the 9 years we used to talk about, and maybe even further depending on your product. I think the aftermarket, it's in the U.S. is exciting in a lot of ways, because I think for some manufacturers, they're going to be talking about a second replacement opportunity inside the sweet spot. So, we can certainly dig more into that at a different time. Be happy to talk about that with whomever asked that question offline as well.
Okay, great. And then are these statistics for personal private vehicles exclusively, or do they include taxis and other types of vehicles like that, where public, there are certain regions where public transportation is more cost effective than owning a vehicle?
Yep. These statistics are off of vehicles that are registered as passenger vehicles, so it would likely not include taxis. I'd have to get back to you on that. We normally call those light commercial vehicles, and most of this reference passenger vehicles.
Great. So unless anyone else has any other questions, that will wrap up our webinar for today. Todd, thank you so much for presenting on that. And up ahead, we have 2 webinars, one in August 11th, the State of the Auto Care Industry with Behzad Rassouli, and then October 6th, Ahead of the Curve at Apex with Jessica Finnerty, what you need to know preparing for the big show. And then save the date, November 2nd, 2016, our Young Professionals program at Apex will once again include professional headshots, the Yang Town Hall, and the happy hour at Lavo. So mark your calendars to attend those events, and we will see everyone next time at the next webinar, August 11th. Thank you. Thanks, Todd.
Sure thing. Thanks.